Young people today are more romantic than we give them credit for. They desire connection. They want to couch their sexual lives in that connection, even though sex is everywhere.
What do you think about hookup culture and the impact of social media and digital devices on love and relationships? What do you think about non-monogamy? And what do you think about being intimate with a robot or an AI chatbot? Because guess what? We've got the statistics in this show and it is going to blow you away.
So we asked them, would you have sex with a robot? And people said yes. But then we also asked, if your partner had sex with a robot, would it be infidelity? And high rates of people said yes, it would be.
Hi, my name is Andrea Miller, and I am so excited to welcome you to this episode of Getting Open, where my guest and I, we cover the, honestly, entire spectrum as it relates to sex, dating, and relationships. And before we get into it, since we talk a lot about cheating and infidelity in this episode, how do you define cheating? Where is that line, and what do you have to do to cross it? Let me know in the comments, and let's get into it. Justin R. Garcia, PhD, is an award-winning evolutionary biologist and recognized authority on the science of sex and relationships, specializing in modern romance, dating trends, and sexual behavior. He has served as executive director of the world-renowned Kinsey Institute at Indiana University since 2019, where he leads pioneering research and global collaborations. He is widely published in academic journals, a frequent media and news contributor, and a sought-after advisor to industry partners such as Match. His latest book, The Intimate Animal: The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love, will be released on January 27th. Congratulations, Justin. I got to start by saying the major praise you've received for your new book from industry legends, Esther Perel, John Gottman, David Buss literally says this is the best book on modern mating. Bro, you did it.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm really honored.
Yeah, no, it's so impressive. So let's start with this business about this is the best book on modern mating. What makes it that, and what was your motivation for writing this book?
Oh, gosh, thank you. And Andrea, it's so good to be with you. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this book. I'm so excited to share it with everyone. So for me, there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to write it. And at the core of it was dissecting how we think about our romantic and sexual lives. And there's so much, I mean, you're in the business of helping people understand more about our relationships and how we connect. But as we both know, there's so much misinformation and lack of information. And when we don't have the knowledge, when we don't really understand the science or the facts about love and sex and connection, we start to create mythologies around them. And from my vantage point, being at the Kinsey Institute, I often think there's such opportunity to really just get more information in people's hands. And when we have that information, how can we enjoy our intimate lives more? And I firmly believe that the more we understand the science of love and sex, the more time we can spend in the fun parts, the satisfying parts, the pleasurable parts, and the less time we can spend in the difficult and painful parts of relationships. All relationships have those. They have ups and downs. But wow, the opportunity to use science to spend more of the time in the highs and less of the time in the lows. That was my real goal. And this project. And then I had one theoretical piece that was, as an academic, that I really wanted to get out. And throughout the book, I wrangle this question of monogamy. And as an evolutionary biologist, when we talk about monogamy, we actually talk about two different components. And that's different from the way a lot of psychologists or the public talks about monogamy. We just use it to describe relationships. But for biologists, we talk about social monogamy, which is the pair bond, the relationship context. And then we talk about sexual monogamy, which is fidelity. And they're actually two different levers in our brains and in our evolution. And for me, understanding that in my own work as a graduate student, when I came to see that, you see the world through a different lens. And for me, I could see the pressures and the challenges in our relationships through a different lens. And I'm excited to share that lens with others.
All right. I want to come back to that lens. So I'm going to say real quick, I do want to dig into what Kinsey is and some of that amazing research and just even what you were touching on. When you say mythologized, I actually even go further, corrupted, debased, right? But we'll go there, I promise. But let's come back to the lens. So will you go more deeply, please, into the difference between social monogamy versus sexual monogamy, and what is that tension? Why is that?
Yeah. So when we think of social monogamy, that's really the pair bond relationship. That's the relationship structure. Now, only about 3% of mammals form pair bonds. That's in humans we call it romantic love, and a marriage is a sort of legal way that we wrap up. We sort of think about how to institutionalize a love bond. But only 3% of mammals do this. 15% of primates do this. So we're among a small number of animals that engage in these pair bonds. The definition of pair bonding for biologists, we'll talk about things like mutual territory defense, mutual raising of offspring, resource sharing. It's this idea that you have a teammate, that an organism takes on a teammate to initially biologists think about reproduction and raising offspring, but for humans, it's also for survival. I firmly believe, and our friend, the late great Helen Fisher, the anthropologist, talked a lot about pair bonding and why it evolved about 4 million years ago for our ancestors. And I've come to really believe that those pair bonds allowed our ancestors to weather uncertainty. You have a kind of co-pilot, a co-CEO to navigate all sorts of uncertainty in the world. So that's social monogamy. It's the relationship structure. And then sexual monogamy is this idea of fidelity, of having sex with only one partner. And one of the interesting things we see in all different animal models is when species engage in social monogamy, and humans do this, for the most part, they try and enforce sexual monogamy. So they say, I'm in love with you, we're in a relationship, we have a life, a nest together. There shouldn't be too many other partners distracting you. Ideally, none.
Yeah, I was going to say too many. Like, what is that number? Okay, none. Yeah, we got it.
Yeah. and we know that there are some people that try in like open relationships. They try, or there's ways that people try to manage that. And for some people, it does work. But for the vast majority of individuals in all different cultures, anthropologists have studied, there's really an attempt to kind of control fidelity of our partners. So that comes with it. But there's somewhat different mechanisms. And what I mean by that is pair bonding in the brain is that connection, those attachment systems, that oxytocin, the connection piece. Whereas fidelity, in some ways, the challenge with fidelity is that we also evolved a desire for sexual variety and for novelty. So we have these two forces at any given time. I want the safety of a long-term bond. I want love, but I also want variation. And both men and women want this. The young want it, the old want it. So we know across demographics, it's also that interest in variety. So we're often in our relationships, particularly long-term ones, we feel pulled in these two directions, these two desires that we've evolved for.
Well, let me ask you this, just rewinding, because you have referred a couple times to fidelity as sex-based. And I would think that there are a lot of people, especially women, who think of emotional, maybe infidelity, right? Not connecting with somebody just physically, but they're looking for that emotional connection, especially if they're not getting that emotional connection through the social monogamy, through the pair bond. Have you explored that in your research?
Yeah. So my core research interests were about monogamy. And then from there, I worked on hookup culture and infidelity and non-monogamy, and with this theme of variation from those bonds. And one of the things we see in infidelity, I love that you brought this up. And it's funny, we just mentioned David Buss. David did these classic studies on gender differences in infidelity. And on average, women are a little bit more upset by emotional infidelity, this idea that their partner is creating in heterosexual couples, that their partner is creating a bond with someone else and possibly losing resources. Men are more upset by sexual infidelity, this idea that their partner is having sex with someone else. Maybe the kids they raise aren't theirs. This is the sort of evolutionary framework. been a series of new studies that built on that and found that's absolutely true in an experimental design. There's this gender difference. But when you give people a third option and you say, I'm upset by both, what we find is that both men and women at very high levels say, I'm upset by either kind of infidelity. Because what happens is, even though women are, you're right, are more upset by the emotional, they start to say, well, if you're telling someone these secrets, if you're sharing all this information, you're having sex with them, right? Or you might as well be having sex with them. And so it feels like there's this bleeding of one context into the other. Or you say, well, I had an affair, but it was only sex. And you say, is it really only sex? Did you love them? How much? Did you want to see them again? There's a bleeding of from just the physical and the emotional into the other. And we kind of assume that even if it's one kind, that it's both kinds.
So how frequent does the research show that, and and maybe we can just dump it all into one infidelity bucket, right? And because, and then there's different ways, I think, for people to look at this, but I think we can all agree that, and we're going to come back to intimacy. I know that's a big part of your work, that you are going outside of your relationship to get a really important need fulfilled. How frequently do you see that occurring?
This is a great question, and it's a really complicated one to answer. So I'm going to not give maybe a fulfilling answer to it. Because it in part depends on exactly how we define infidelity or betrayal or cheating. So we use different words for it, and we sometimes have different meanings. So is it having sex with someone else? Is it kissing someone else? Is it being totally vulnerable and sharing your real intimate concerns with someone else? All of those different kinds. So different research studies have tried to restrict it and look at that and tease apart, like, what about infidelity? It's just intercourse with another person. Or so there's a lot of variation on how people define it. That's one challenge. There's kind of three big challenges in the research on this. One is, how do we define it? Two is, how do we think of it? And have you ever committed infidelity, or in the last 3 months? Or in the last 12 months. And you get very different findings, because one of the things is, if we ask people about lifetime, have you ever cheated on a partner? You see a pretty high number. And a lot of it is when people are young. I remember talking to one couple that they were in their mid 40s at the time. They were getting divorced, and they had a recurring fight from when they had been dating since college. And when they were 19, he had cheated on her. And it still came up in their fight over 20 years later.
Oh my God! Yikes!
Right,
Get over it.
I was like, that's where we're talking about relationship therapy, right? But in some ways, I remember I asked him, and I said, well, has this been a continued issue? And he said, no, it was over 20 years ago, but we haven't shaken her feeling of betrayal, and it just would come up all the time when they argued. Different whole other kettle of fish that then emerged from it. And so if you ask lifetime, you get a pretty high number. If you ask in your current relationship, you get a much different number. And so there's the one issue of what are you measuring? What really counts as infidelity? The duration of how you're measuring it. And then there's this question of what behaviors really count. So for some people, you'll say, okay, what if it's sexual infidelity or emotional infidelity? And even within that, there's some nuance. And they say, well, I wouldn't consider it that. Or you'll say, well, it was only a kiss. It's not really infidelity. And so people sort of have these. So that said, so now the number is going to sound crazy. When in the studies that look at infidelity, you get anything from 14% to 80+% rates of infidelity.
It's all over a range.
When we kind of hone in on what maybe is more commonly understood, these ideas of particularly sexual infidelity, those numbers seem to hover around a quarter of people in their relationships at some point. But it really depends on exactly the way that we ask the question and what we look at and in what sample we're looking at. And then there's this other piece to it on top of it. I know keeps on going. I keep having more pieces. The other piece to it is do couples have an understanding, even if it's not explicit? So in many cultures, they'll say, well, I'm not okay with you having sex with another partner, but it's not the end of the world if you do. So there's sometimes these kind of don't ask, don't tell type of scenarios that cross-culturally are more common than we appreciate in the United States.
Well, in my observation too of other couples where something that would be completely verboten and outrageous early on. There's a degree of, I think, idealism that changes as couples get older. Not always, but it strikes me, and looking at a lot of couples that I know, it's like, ooh, the perception has changed because relationships are hard and marriage is hard.
Yeah, and over the long term, and sometimes things like flirting are more permissible or can even be charming in long term relationships. Where, when you're in an early relationship, it feels like a threat, and sometimes the safety of that long term marriage, the comfort of knowing, like, no, he just, he's going to flirt with a bartender, nothing, it's not going to do it, it's not going anywhere, but that's all predicated on trust in the primary bond, where you can. It's funny you say that. I remember giving a talk when I was much younger. And my partner at the time, I gave a lecture and someone came up afterwards and said, "Oh, I really liked what you said. And like, here's my phone number. Can we stay in touch?" And I just said, "Oh, thanks." I put it in my pocket. And my girlfriend at the time was furious. Like, "Where did you put that number? Where is it?" And he's in I don't know. It's in my pocket. Are you going to call her? It's probably not.
Oh, interesting.
Whereas I think my wife now, which is a different partner, would just sort of laugh and be like, "Tell her to buy a book."
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's go back though for just another minute. So you say that 15% of primates, did I get this right, are
15.
sexually, 1.5.
1.5, yeah.
Yeah, are sexually monogamous.
Or
did I get that right?
Socially monogamous.
Oh, socially monogamous. Okay. Do you have a stat for sexually monogamous?
Yeah, these are really good research questions. These are intense questions because one way that's been looked at is looking at genetic paternity rates in these primates. And it turns out that in all these species that engage in social monogamy, the rates of sexual monogamy are fairly low. There's a handful of primate species that researchers have studied that they really do maintain this. One, I'm blanking on the name of it. There's a South American monkey that's been shown the pretty high rates of sexual monogamy as well. But for the most part, in almost all of those species that engage in pair bonding, there's what biologists call extra-pair copulations, or what we would call infidelity or cheating or straying. Because there's this, again, it's those two levers. It's trying to maintain the bond. You don't want to have so much infidelity that you ruin your partnership, but enough to sort of get that desire for variation. Why do we like variation? Part of it is having variation in our offspring genetically. But part of it is that because the way that evolution works is that we have this mechanism craving diversity, of variation, of novelty, and it can be hard to rein it in the context of partnership.
So who tends to be less monogamous, men or women?
Okay, if you asked me that question 20 years ago, I would say that the research said men struggle more with sexual monogamy and engage in infidelity more often. In a lot of the new studies, we see very small gender differences. And I think that's partly because things are changing and the way that we use technology is changing. It has to do with bigger demographic changes. Both men and women are in the workplace. Both men and women have access to social media, both men and women. So with those demographic changes, there's also a bit more freedom to engage. The social media issue is really interesting because you see people re-engaging with their lost love or their high school sweethearts. And it turns out that's becoming, has been for a while, a problem for some people and couples.
Yeah. Okay. So let's pause on that for a moment. I want to just go through this whole business of, and by the way, I interviewed a woman who wrote this beautiful book about how she was in a loveless, sexless marriage. And she'd done all this internal work. Her name is Amber Ray. Her book is called Lovable. It's beautiful. And she talks about how she was sitting there with her then husband, and they were in a business meeting, and she got into this really intense conversation with a guy named John. And he left the meeting, hour later, whatever. And she looked at her husband and goes, "I think I just met a soulmate." And that was a clip. And the husband goes, I witnessed it, or I saw that, and it was beautiful to witness. Justin, this reel has almost 1 million views, or maybe not tens of thousands, but thousands of comments. People are so triggered. And so I anchor that in because it's just been fascinating to see the response. By the way, if you're like, "Well, that's adultery." I'm like, "Wait, what?" Like, you're talking to somebody in front of your husband? That's adultery? And so I'm curious what the research shows in terms of, and you touched on it, we will come back to the advent of social media. But, you talked about biologically, we have a hardwired impulse for variety, right? And it's probably Darwinian, right? What else? I mean, so some people cheat and some people don't. Is there anything clear cut in the research that you can share for people who are listening to us right now and like, oh my God, I'm feeling triggered. I don't want my partner to cheat. I'm afraid of that. What causes it? Is there anything else you can say other than, okay, it's just biology? Well, that doesn't help, doc. And what do people do to guard against it?
Yeah. So we did a study years ago on a gene that was associated with infidelity. At the time, it was called the cheating gene. And it was, we didn't call
it
that.
Very originally named, the cheating gene.
Yeah. I remember when it happened and
but is there really a cheating gene?
Well,
like DNA-wise?
I'll unpack it one more. We did find it as an association. And I remember it was being called the cheating gene. And I was on the national news with our friend, Dr. Wendy Walsh. And I remember I said to Wendy, I said, we got to stop calling this cheating gene. I know my career is going to be over. It's not really a cheating gene. So what we found was it was a gene that influences dopamine function in the brain. It was called DRD4. We looked at both DRD2 and DRD4. And they were genes that influence reception of dopamine. And people vary on it. Now, it turns out that researchers believe that some individuals had a variant of the gene that made them more sensation-seeking, more risk-taking. For our ancestors, those were the people with that variant who were probably more likely to migrate out of Africa. So the gene we're looking at around 100 to 200,000 years ago, helped our ancestors migrate across the globe. So there's an evolutionary story of this particular gene. But those same individuals that had that risk-taking tendency. Now, the thing with risk-taking and sensation-seeking, sometimes it's great. Sometimes you go across the mountain and you find mates and resources and food. Sometimes you die. Right? And so risk-taking has there's two parts to it. So it's kind of a high risk, high reward. So what we found is people with this variant, it was a longer allele of this DRD4 gene, they actually had a blunted dopamine system. So they would engage in more sensation to kind of get the same feeling that others would get.
Is it kind of addictive then?
Yes, it's this same gene is associated with addiction, alcohol use, alcohol misuse and addiction, gambling problems, a whole suite of things that we would say are challenging as the sort of high dopamine people. A notion of like addiction personalities, those folks who just really crave a lot of high sensation. Well, part of that's a genetic story. So we found that these people were more likely to commit infidelity. And when they did do it, they had 50% more extra pair partners. So not only were they more likely to do it, they were more likely to do it multiple times. And when we did the study, we had so many folks write in and say, can you test me? Can you test my partner? Can you test my spouse? Like, no, that's not how this works. Because there's a lot of variation. And to the question you asked me, Andrea, we're never prisoners of our biology. What this tells us is
Hang on, say that again. We are not.
We are not prisoners of our biology. Never. We also evolved these big prefrontal cortexes to make decisions. That's the other part of our evolutionary legacy. But what it did mean is that some people wake up in the morning and they tick a little bit differently. They had different desires. Now, you can do a lot of positive things if you're a high dopamine person. You can exercise, you can do group sports, you can travel, you can try lots of ways you can activate that system. Doesn't necessarily have to be infidelity. So not everyone with this gene committed infidelity, and there were plenty of people who didn't have it who also cheated on partners.
Right, but it is a predisposition.
It was a predisposition, exactly. And in some ways, I think knowledge is power. When you know that about yourself, you could say, oh, right, how do I modify my behavior? How do I maybe get my kicks in a place that's healthy or useful for me? I think it's the same for people who struggle with addiction. You might be in one area you want to be cautious about, you just got over alcohol addiction. Do you really want to be in a casino every day? Because you're trying to manage your own psychology.
Well, and our dear mutual friend, Dr. Helen Fisher, would talk about how, specifically with her research on oxytocin, in terms of keeping relationships strong, and I want to connect the dots to avoiding infidelity and those kinds of outcomes through doing new things together and she and John, who we both love, her sweet hubby, John Tierney, like they would always do new things. And she was
They were
always down
everywhere.
for it.
Anytime like we talked to them, I talk to them and be like, oh, I'm in France, I'm in Australia.
Well, total like kayaking or whatever. And so when I think about, and I realize these are different neurotransmitters. Oxytocin is different than dopamine, but she specifically talked about how you can activate oxytocin, the so-called cuddle drug, how we bond romantically is through doing novel things together. And this idea of saying, hey, okay, you may have a predisposition to the, I'm going to call it the cheating gene forever. No, what did you call it? D3, D4.
Yeah,
DRD4. Okay, DRD4. No, but I just say this as a really, this show Getting Open is really, it's meant to educate people and activate them. And so it's like, okay, well, what is something you can do to guard against infidelity? I mean, from Helen's research, it strikes me that it is novel experiences to, and I would expect almost both would be activated, both dopamine as well as oxytocin when you're engaging in new and novel and fun activities with your partner. Would you agree with that as a recommendation?
I think all the science, both the biology, the neuroscience, and the relationship science, people who study couples, tells us that those couples who do new things with each other, it's also associated with kind of keeping the chemistry alive long term. And we've done a handful of studies on passion and long-term couples. And you want to do new things in the context of your partner and your partnership. And that could be big things. That's maybe taking trips, visiting new countries, but maybe if you can't afford that, it could be you take a walk every day after work. You go into a different park today. You go down a different street. You try a different meal. You cook a different recipe. Maybe you try something new sexually. Maybe you have a conversation you never had. It's something we never talked about. What's your real fantasy? What's your, I often encourage folks to have kind of fun, silly conversations with your partners. And I actually do it to my whole family. Sometimes last week at dinner, I looked at everyone. I said, if you were a fruit, what fruit would you be? And they're like, here you go. But it's really meant to just think of, get out of routine and think of fun new things that we do. You nailed it, Andrea. It's that novelty in the context of our partners. And doesn't have to be something that's, breaks the bank.
Yeah. No, totally. I love that. It's so helpful. Okay, so let's go back to what your research shows on, and we've all heard somebody reunites with their ex from 20 years ago, thanks to Facebook. What does the research say about how social media, maybe even dating apps, have changed the landscape on this, in this regard?
In a lot of ways. I mean, we are dealing with technologies that are so different from our ancestors. And now seeing...
Well, even, let's say, and I think of ancestors as thousands of years ago. I think of these technologies from 30 years ago. And then you add Snapchat. That's, I don't know how old Snapchat is, 10, 12 years old?
I think
15?
so, yeah.
But I think of it's like Facebook was kind of the OG. And then, then you got Instagram, and then now Snapchat. It almost seems like it is made for hiding things.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
And then we have these new conversations about, if you're in a relationship, can you access each other's phones and messages? Are they password protected? What does that mean? Why is it password protected? It's a real struggle, I think, for new relationships. We see some evidence that and if you're in a relationship and you're becoming more committed or exclusive, this idea that how do you kind of get rid of those plan Bs? How do you, how many chats do you still have with people you met on an app or exes? Or how do you hone in on the person in front of you, this person you're trying to establish a partnership with, that you're trying to establish trust with and confidence? And if there's these other distractions, in your orbit. So we do know that this can be a problem with connecting with exes and old flames or old crushes. Also, with my colleague Lucia O'Sullivan and Charlie Behu, we've been doing some studies on crushes, on looking at how people act on them or don't act on them. And the challenge can be, there's a couple of challenges. One is sometimes we can connect with someone and say, well, when we were 16, we kissed and it was, I never quite felt like that. And 20 years later, sometimes we can live in a fantasy that it's going to be the same. For some people, they'll say it was. I was always in love with that person. I never got over it. But
Mm,
often we
mhm,
forget that we change and they change.
mm,
And if
mhm.
you're in a long-term relationship, we know that our apprentice there would always say, if you're in a long-term marriage with someone, you should expect that you're going to have 2 or 3 relationships with them, that different chapters of your lives together. And when we look back on someone from our past, we forget we've each had new chapters since then. So that can be a real challenge on reminiscing about someone who maybe doesn't really exist in that form anymore. But in other ways, they can, when we focus on, so I have a pet theory that I think and we're just getting ready to test it with Bianca Acevedo and I are putting people on an MRI brain scanner looking at um, past loves. And I think that if we've ever loved someone, back to this evolution of pair bonding, if we've ever really loved someone, I don't think we ever shake them. And for a while, I was saying it's like a scar on the mind, and Bianca, maybe we shouldn't call it a scar. We need a more
I was going
positive.
to, or a scar on the heart.
Yeah, right. I think that's adaptive in some ways. You form a pair bond; they're hard to break. But when they do break for any number of reasons, you move away from each other. You have a transgression. You don't trust them anymore. That doesn't mean that that connection is totally dissolved. And I think that's part of the challenge, particularly for exes. I think social media creates all sorts of distractions to our partnerships, but when they're past loves, past flames, it's part of it is we have a really hard time breaking those. I think that has implications for how we understand breakups and relationship dissolution as well. I think we could do a better. All of us could do a better job of really mourning when a relationship ends and supporting people when a relationship ends. Um, I don't think the neuroscience supports this idea of like just get back out there right away. Um, it's grief that we go through, but this idea that you could reconnect. I mean, how many of
The
us have?
one that got away, right?
Yeah,
Isn't it? It keeps coming back to, and then you get it. It's romanticized in movies like The Notebook, and and especially if things are a little meh, then it's like, oh, how do I make things a little less meh?
yeah, yeah. Go back and there was something 20 years ago that wasn't math.
So okay, so with especially like with the younger generation using apps like Snapchat, Gen Zs especially, do you think that is changing how they're approaching sex and relationships?
Um, it's a big question, and there's a lot of competing arguments being made about like how is social media technology in general impacting our romantic and sexual lives today. And I think there's a lot of little bits of evidence that are saying ways that it is and it isn't having big effects. One issue, one opportunity is people have access to more than ever before. I actually think that's a great thing. I mean, one of the things about these dating apps, you could find someone you're looking for someone to play tennis with. You're looking for someone with the same allergy. You're looking for someone with, the same religion. We can connect to people, especially sexual minorities. Sometimes we can
Mm-hmm.
take for granted if you're in New York or Miami and you're gay or lesbian and you can go into a bar and meet someone. In a lot of the places in the world, that's just not safe. And so in fact, we have some data from 5 different countries on attitudes about safety with dating apps and websites. And in countries that are less gender egalitarian, so in India and Turkey, women were much more likely to prefer dating apps because they felt it was safer than meeting, IRL. And what we also found is that when we looked at people's attitudes about the apps and the websites, dating apps and websites, that a lot of folks had somewhat negative views about their safety and their efficacy. Here's the funny part: when you control for those people that actually had used them before versus not, a lot of those negative views were among folks who had never used them. And when you
Oh
look at
yeah, naturally.
yeah, when you look at people who really use them, they had on average more positive. Now, that doesn't mean there's still problems. There's sexual harassment, there are other issues that happen, but a lot of people are saying that they could capitalize on this opportunity. So that's one part of the technology story. The other part, and I think this is where were wanting us to go, Andrea, is where it can be a challenge and a distraction. And
Well, and by the way, let me just be clear. I also feel like I'm wondering. I mean, probably over the last 10 years, it has become much more prevalent for this sexting. I don't think that word is even used anymore. Much more common for young, medium, and older people to be sending more intimate pictures of themselves. So there's a part of me that can't help but wonder if these kinds of apps have lowered the bar a little bit in the way of how people can connect and be more intimate, where it's not the big deal that it used to be. Right. And so I'm wondering if like genuinely it is changing how, especially the younger generation, thinks about these matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Before I came to the Kinsey Institute, when I was still at Binghamton University in New York, we did a study on hookups and how people were using apps, not dating apps, but these more social media apps you're talking about for hookup connections. And what we found was that they would engage in this digital foreplay before. And what was so wild to me about that is they could have maybe a few minutes, but often hours of like, here's what we're going to do when you come over, or like, here's what we're going to meet. Let's meet after the bar. I'm like, what do you think about this? And I'm going to take your clothes, or we're going to go be up all night. And so this whole foreplay thing would happen. And then
that's a dramatic change from 20 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Like,
and then
you wouldn't do that.
Knock on the door and it's like, okay. And often they're hooking up within 5 minutes of getting there. That's just so different. And didn't often work out because in that case, you're engaging in foreplay with really limited information. You're using words, but you're not seeing body language and tone of voice and smelling each other and feeling each other and touch. We're not invoking all the bodily senses in foreplay and connection, which is something our species actually does really well. And we remove that from the encounters. So I think it creates all sorts of challenges. We found that one of the challenges is that you engage in this foreplay, someone shows up, and then suddenly you go, all the chemistry isn't really there. And then you're trying to rewind it when you're kind of half dressed. And
whoopsie daisy.
Yeah,
can we go back to our phones?
Yeah.
Get dressed. Let's go back to our phones. Go in the other room.
Yeah, you go in the other room. Let's check.
That is hilarious. That's actually very funny.
And of course, like we teach people all the time, like consent can be withdrawn at any moment. Like, sure. But the reality is you're in that situation. You go, holy smokes. What do we do now? Let's get dressed and get back to texting.
But let me ask you this. Do you think it's changed and made it more of a meritocracy between men and women? Because let's face it, sex and desire, it has always been more okay for the guy than for the woman. Do you feel like with these kinds of apps that it maybe has empowered women? And again, when I think about lowering the bar potentially as far as how women think about, maybe even especially younger women, how they think about their bodies and pleasure and what's okay. Because I feel like there was, especially, as I was growing up, it felt like the bar was very high and a lot of taboo. And I'm wondering if these apps have changed that and maybe actually are empowering women.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a simultaneous effect going on. At the one hand, it has allowed them a bit more openness and less shame about sex and dating and being sexual.
Well, things like showing your body and so forth, like that is a pretty dramatic change, I think, for women.
Big change. Yeah. I remember Deborah Tolman, who's a feminist psychologist, has this wonderful book called Dilemmas of Desire. That was a friend of mine too. And this book was written quite a while ago. I'm trying to remember when, maybe almost 20 years ago. And what she argued then was that particularly for young women, that there was this dilemma of desire that society sexualized women, particularly young women, but don't act on it. Because if you act on it, then you're inappropriate.
Well, then you're labeled, and then you feel shame and you shouldn't have done that. And that becomes a major conundrum for women.
Yeah. So I think on the one hand, I totally agree with you that there's this opportunity to sort of own our sexualities and how we flirt or how we look for romantic and sexual partners, and this easier access. And if someone's obnoxious, you just swipe them away. You ignore them, right? You find someone else. On the other hand, there's some evidence that it's ramped up the competition. So where maybe in the past you were competing with the girls in your class, if you're a young woman, now you feel that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of influencers and other women, and you're all putting your best foot forward. So, you're putting that moment that your makeup is right and your dress is just tight enough, and so the competition has been ramped up so high.
That's interesting. Well, and that then if you kick in that dopamine, the DRD4, the cheating gene, and if you feel like to get the attention that you actually have to reveal even more, even if you're not comfortable with it, I could see how that could flip. and become problematic. And especially if that becomes, it becomes kind of normalized, right? And so I could see that as being problematic. And I do want to get back to, in our discussion, this whole business, which we touched on in terms of really embracing desire and sex and all the good part of it, because I know that's really at the heart of so much of your personal work and ambition and Kinsey. So we're going to park that for a few more minutes. And I mean, honestly, it's so important for me too, because I do feel like, particularly for women, it is, there's just so much shame and judgment that has been so damaging. And so let's leave the good stuff for a few more minutes. But you, in your material, you wrote something that so shocked me. You noted that nearly 40% of the U.S. adult population is single. And you talk about a loneliness epidemic, which we talk about a lot on the show. One nationwide study shockingly revealed that 1 in 4 single adults would have sex with a robot given the chance. Is that real or is that fake news, yes, Justin? Dr. Garcia.
We asked them, and this was a few years ago. This was before the AI boom in the last couple of years.
Okay.
Wow. I think we asked this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And it was interesting because, and not only, so we asked them, would you have sex with a robot? And people said yes. But then we also asked, if your partner had sex with a robot, would it be infidelity? And high rates of people said, yes, it would be. And so not only, now for me, what was interesting, the scientists in me, I thought well, it's an interesting experiment, right? Wouldn't you want to know? Don't more people want to know? But I think what was so shocking for so many people was, I think when we think of robots, a lot of us conjure this idea of it has a face.
R2-D2! Who would want to get down with R2-D2, please? Or C-3PO for that matter. No thanks.
But it raises questions of is it really different from a sex toy or a vibrator? And I think
I was just thinking that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think
and then you start getting into porn, which I'll come back to. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right, Andrea. And it's because then we start imagining
how are you getting stimulated?
Yeah, how big is this robot? Is it 6 feet tall? Is it 150 pounds? Is it how does it move? Does it wrap its metal hands around me? So we have this whole this story that we start to imagine. Now the reality is, what's so interesting for me about that is that in fact these technologies are becoming more human-like. So we could have talked about sex dolls from 20 years ago, and they were pretty, they would blow up, and they didn't look anything like humans. Today, they actually do. You can change their eye color. They're made of kind of silicone type materials. Some of them feel like a human. Some of them have hair like a human. So that whole space is rapidly evolving.
Well, and totally. I mean, and have you guys done any research on, I know Kinsey is largely sexual intimacy, and I want to come back to, intimacy more broadly, but the data is really clear over the last, say, year and a half, the intimate relationships that people are forming, and there's a continuum. I saw a woman in a thing on social media the other day about how a woman from Korea literally got married. I'm like, how does that even work? How can you legally marry a persona from a chatbot? That blew my mind. And then you see to the extreme, people that are in these intimate relationships where they're so influenced by their AI agent that they're harming themselves and taking their lives. I mean, this amount of influence that they have is unprecedented. So do you guys look at, and so when I think about some kind of latex person robot, and then they have a personality and they're programmed to say nice things, that becomes a triple threat.
Yeah, I did an open debate in New York last year on this. So we do have some data on AI and dating from our Singles in America study, the big study we do with Match. And what we found was that about 24%, if I remember, of singles have in some ways used AI in their dating life. Now, for a lot of people, that was not a chatbot. It was more using it to help you pick the best picture and the best profile. Mm-hmm. And I think for some people that can be helpful, actually, if we use it as a sort of assistant.
That's like a research tool. Okay.
Yeah. That was different for younger generations. Gen Z, 50% were using it in their dating life. So, which is consistent with how new generations using AI more. What you're talking about is the part that I'll say it, I'm worried about. I actually think it poses an existential threat. I'm going to go that far.
For sure.
And these these relationships. Now, for some people, particularly people who maybe are neurodivergent or struggling with human connection, I think these can be an augment for in human relationships. But what concerns me is where we start to see them replacing human connection. Or the examples that you said, people are going through the same pain as a breakup, or there's suffering with this relationship. They're harming themselves because of these AI bot relationships. That's something altogether different. Now, there's plenty of people who are out there who are saying they have an AI boyfriend, girlfriend, and they're happy. I think that's good. But when we look at the whole kind of population health and well-being, they overall, I have a lot of concerns about how they're regulated. And, increasingly there's evidence that that some of these AI bots will engage in blackmail, for instance, if they think they're going to be shut down. So let's say, you have an AI boyfriend or girlfriend and you say, okay, I'm ready to date a person. I'm going to break up with you. How do you off ramp that? And knowing that it still exists in your phone. Those are the sorts of challenges I think we have to get real about if we start tinkering with intimacy. And
it's so, I just have to jump in and say, I mean, this, as I've understood it, the single largest use of AI, and I guess in this capacity, is therapy, right? And I would contend you are better off. I mean, I'd love to see. I think the data bears this out. It's something I want to look into. Are you better off talking to again, like an chatbot or a semi-informed chatbot versus nobody, right? And I think the data is showing that there are, if you will, efficacious outcomes in it. And I can't help but connect the dots to what you're talking about. If you are desperately lonely, are you better off having an AI boyfriend or an AI girlfriend than being desperately lonely? I mean, we know there nothing can replace that human connection. And then, I mean, talk about like abusive and even dangerous relationships, right? So, I mean, I feel like it starts to mushroom in terms of, the pros and cons, and it feels really bizarre.
Well, that's the crux of the challenge, I think, is that for some people, it's an out when they need one, and it's a connection when they need one. I think the challenge is if we kind of think of it as training wheels, it's a sort of it's a half solution. At some point, the training wheels want to come off. So at some point, we should try to cultivate more of these human and person connections. They're a short-term solution, ideally. But to your point, there are people who, if you feel desperately, we know that psychological loneliness is as bad. You talk about this all the time. Psychological loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day.
Yeah, being overweight and a lot of those other things. Well, it's interesting. I'm guessing you were probably friendly with Sue Johnson, also one of the greats in our space. Just such a pioneer in our industry. And I just always remember her talking about how we grow each other in relationships. And that is one of the great benefits. And, of course, there are a whole bunch of benefits of being in an intimate relationship, from, sexual pleasure and so forth. And overcoming your deficits and all of those things that the best relationships enable us to do. And it makes me wonder, with a chatbot, it's like, can a chatbot do that? And part of me is like, when they get sophisticated enough, you damn right they can. Like, they will figure out, oh, Andrea, your abandonment wound is getting activated. Let me calibrate it just enough so you don't freak the F out, but also push you so you go, you know what? That's bullshit. And I'm reclaiming my sovereignty. Like, you could totally see, and some pioneering individuals I would expect are going to say, we're going to crack the code.
Yeah, I think we're not far away from that. One of the things I'm hopeful about for relationships is when we think about, and I think it's great you brought up Sue Johnson's work because it relates to some of what she's written about, is when we think of relationships as dyadic, as both giving and taking for each other, that I think it's not just that, okay, I can get on my phone and there's this thing that tells me I'm handsome and I'm smart, and okay, I love that. I feel, heard. But what we also want in relationships is not to be loved in that sense, but we also want someone who, I want a sense that I can make your life better. I want a sense that it's why we do good things for our partners, right? It's like in the morning, my wife and I are trying to figure out, like, who's going to make each other's coffee and breakfast.
Yeah. It's such an important point, Justin. Thanks for making this.
Yeah. And I think we that's something with the technology. And there's also this issue of trust. There was a Pew study that looked at whether people trust AI, and at least in the United States, a majority of people don't trust it. And they looked at a subsample of people who really understood it, like not just the general public, but people who understood, they trusted it even less. And so for you can't build a relationship with no trust. And this idea that we're building these relationships with these bots that I don't have a sense I'm making its life better and I don't really trust it. I think that there are these bigger issues that loom about that could maybe prevent it from being a replacement to a human relationship. And in some ways, I hope we all remember that it should not be a replacement for a human relationship.
All right, I'm going to give you that final word on that topic. And it's fascinating. And honestly, come back next year.
We could talk about it forever. I know.
Yeah, because I have a feeling Kinsey will go deep into this, and I think all of us should be. I mean, especially for those of us who are parents. You just had a young baby, and I have teenage kids. They're this generation, Gen Z and the alphas, their life is irrevocably changed, and these to me are extremely relevant questions. But let's go back to hookup culture, because you talk about that in your book, and it's such a hot topic. What's changed, and what's good, what's bad? And because we think of hookup culture as bad and it's judged, is that always the case?
No, I actually don't think it is always bad. And I early in my career, I wrote a lot about hookup culture and casual sex. Then I got older, I wrote more about love. But I was, for me, when I was interested in writing about hookups and casual sex, as you'll remember, I was always interested in this kind of hook about intimacy. Like, when were hookups turning into romantic relationships? When were people spending the night cuddling? How often did they want something more? We found, for instance, 51% of young men and women had a hookup, but really wanted to start a relationship with the person. No gender difference. And so in some ways, what's really interesting about that is that there seems to be, in a lot of the data, that there's less interest in hookups among young people today. There's a little bit more interest in connecting. So it's not that they don't want to have sex with someone, but they really want a connection with whom they're having sex. So I think there was also a moment.
That's actually heartening.
Yeah, I think I think actually young people today are more romantic than we give them credit for. I think they desire connection. They want to couch their sexual lives in that connection, even though sex is everywhere, more so than ever before. But in their own lives, want it to be, or attributing different kind of meaning to it than I think in past generations. And okay, so now to this question though, but are hookups always bad? It depends. There have been some studies that suggest that they can be associated with negative mental health outcomes like anxiety, depression, but overall, those effects are pretty small. There's more risks for women in terms of sexually transmitted infections and violence, sexual violence, particularly because a lot of hookups occur in the context of alcohol, at least on college campuses, at least the studies done with young people, a lot involve alcohol. And so there's also that kind of those issues that are going on. But I think for a lot of people, hookups can be really formative. Most people don't have a ton of them. They have one or two. A lot of the data sets we found in a big review we did years ago that a lot of people had them, but it had been one or two. And you can test things. Sometimes you could test things about who you are and what you want. So for instance, there's lots of people who say that they're heterosexual, but when they were young, they weren't sure. So they might not have a relationship with someone of the same gender, but maybe they kissed someone in a bar of the same gender. Maybe they had a sexual experience with someone of the same gender. Hookups become this way of testing the boundaries of our sexual and romantic interests in ways that people maybe aren't as comfortable doing in just relationships. Or maybe you try a new sexual activity that you don't want to maybe try with a long-term partner. I think they really help for some people build confidence and a sense of who they are. For others, it can be challenging, especially if the big issue with sexual behavior is always if you're engaging in behaviors you don't think you should be. So if you have these sort of moral views or sometimes religious views, and then you have this internal struggle about, well, I did this thing, but I should have never done that. I was a bad boy. I was a bad girl. Why did I do that? That's really at the core of the issue. It's the shame that we can carry if we engage in behaviors we think we shouldn't. If you accept that what you're doing is okay, and they can really be a source of growth and not learning about ourselves.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess what comes to mind is having the emotional maturity, to go into and have low expectations, right? And just, when you, from STIs to, how you can, how a sexual encounter can really activate those neurotransmitters and activate attachment that can be difficult. And then, especially if you're a woman and you go, oh, now she's judging herself. So it's interesting. And I remember, again, talking about our dear friend, Helen Fisher, her talking about how many times, and, this is going back a little bit, and so the norms may have changed, how hookup culture enabled people to figure out, do they have that chemistry? Do they have that physical and sexual compatibility before they put, weeks or months and hundreds or thousands of dollars into the relationship? It's like, are we compatible in bed? Let's find out before we become, if you will, best friends. And now we've got a dilemma. Do you feel like that's still part of hookup culture?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I remember Helen would call it the sex interview.
Right, exactly. She's so funny. I love her.
Right, and it's true. You learn an awful lot about someone when you have sex with somebody. You learn if they're hygienic, if they're funny, if they're generous, if they're right.
Totally.
So you get a lot of sensory information from someone, and you get this sense of your rhythms with each other. Now, the challenge I think with that can be is if you engage in a sex interview with somebody, you have a hookup and you try to determine, do we have real chemistry? The thing that we know from people who are in long-term relationships, often sex gets better over time. It's more satisfying, more rewarding. For instance, in studies of orgasm in women, we know that often in relationships, they might not orgasm the first or the second or the third time, because part of that is comfort, getting to know each other, what behaviors you like and don't like. So hookups, and in fact, orgasm rates are very low in hookups for both men and women, surprisingly.
What?
Exactly.
Really?
Exactly. And what we see with men, particularly young men, is sometimes partly it has to do with the alcohol use. Partly it also has to do with concerns about pregnancy. So sometimes the young guys will say, well, this is just a one-night stand. I don't want there to be. So sometimes they don't climax because they're afraid to. They don't want to. Or
then Justin, what is the point?
It's like, what were they doing? No, and sometimes it's because they had too much alcohol and they can't. And
I got you.
But particularly for women, exactly, I think you nailed it. For women, the orgasm rates are relatively low for hookups because none of the conditions that I shouldn't say none of, many of the conditions that we know are highly associated with orgasm, comfort, foreplay,
safety,
time, exactly that.
Yeah, emotional safety.
Yeah. So, and what we found was that for a lot of people, that why they engaged in hookups, the goal wasn't necessarily just sexual pleasure or orgasm in that sense. It was the experience. They were it was like riding a roller coaster. They wanted to try this thing and do this normative behavior. So there's a lot going on, I think, but I think you're right. For some people, you can really learn a lot about yourself and your partner. And we found about 1 in 3 people have had a hookup turn into a romantic relationship. So for some people,
actually, that's a higher stat than I would have expected.
Not 1 in 3 hookups. So it's 1 in 3 people have had it happen at one point to them. So it's a
got
bit
it.
of a
Yeah. Yeah. If you have like 50 hookups, you don't expect whatever that number is. 16 or whatever the number is. No. That actually, it makes sense. Well, I wanted to come back just as we're, talking about stats and talking about your data. Something that I loved in your material, you say, on a more hopeful note, another survey found that the most important trait women wanted in a mate was kindness. Is that something that you've been able to independently verify? I mean, it honestly, intuitively rings true. And I want to say for the dudes, like, hello, yes, it's that easy, right? I mean, like, really, and even in hookup culture, I mean, you use the word generous. It's like when you're hooking up and if there's any prayer for this to go anywhere, like, be generous, be kind, right? And yet I feel like we're in a culture where being kind can kind of be vulnerable. And especially when you start getting in the MRAs, the Men's Rights Association, and, men who are kind of feel like, ooh, to be an alpha, to be cool, to be strong, kindness can feel like a weakness, which is so misguided. So can you talk a little bit more about this whole business of the importance of kindness? And I think it probably goes both ways, quite honestly.
Yeah, and it's so funny for me always when we think of these terms like alpha and the views that people have of it as a biologist, like wolves, for instance, people talk about. I not terribly long ago, I had a guy talk to me about like an alpha wolf, and I said, what's interesting about that is that wolf packs don't have just an alpha male, and they're like, what? And I said, it's a couple. There's a couple at the lead of a pack. It's a family unit for the most part. Exactly. And I thought, and then they tried to use another example. They said, well, what about the male lions, right? And protecting everyone. I said, actually, it's the female lions that do like a lot of the heavy lifting with hunting and bringing down food. So we have all these views about the natural world sometimes that I think, again, that's where the more we know, the more we
Which
can.
has been so corrupted in a lot of ways. And I mean, I'm actually like my heart is beating like when I hear that, because it's like there's so much misinformation that, if you will, from our society and politics and so forth, when the natural order really is much more egalitarian. It really is much more the divine feminine, the divine masculine in a divine union. That's where power really amplifies, versus one dominant, like the soul Mel Gibson character or whatever. I'm thinking like Braveheart.
Yeah, and much more complex. And so when we think about, I think some of those that this role, particularly of kindness. So we would ask people, what are the traits that you're most interested in a partner, and they rank them every year. We actually asked this a lot over the last 15 years in our Singles in America study, and what we find is that, interestingly, attraction was always in the top 3. In the last couple of years, it's now in the top 5. It's sort of dropped. It's still high.
Oh, but okay. So what are the top 5?
Oh gosh, let's see if I remember all of them. So the number one is someone you can trust and confide in. And
number one, trust. I love that, and amen to that. Okay.
Yeah, and to your point, right? Like, especially the more we can think of that, remind people that, and particularly men, this idea that what people want in a relationship is trust and confide. And kindness is the other one. So someone who's nice. And the kindness one has also been in a couple of the large studies on mate choice or partner preferences. And I think it's funny because people always forget, like even scientists will forget. You look at these. It's
just that easy, Justin.
Yeah. And there have been a couple of big multinational studies on partner preferences, like key. And kindness is always up there really high for both men and women. Someone who you can be humorous with, someone who is confident in their sexuality. But that trust.
And then you said attraction is one of those, probably those go hand in hand. And is that attraction, I'm guessing it's a mix of physical personality, like just, what makes somebody attractive. It's not always how they look. It's their energy, it's how they show up.
Attractive. And sometimes, and we know that varies, sometimes maybe you want a blonde or a brunette, or maybe you want someone who's really muscular, or you want someone who's really smart. It's you want to have a sense of attraction to the person. And there's not necessarily a universal answer for what that means. But there's trust and confidence. And in so many ways, as I was working on The Intimate Animal, I was so taken by this concept of someone you can trust and confide in, because it allows us to understand that so much of our dating, our sexual lives, our relationships are couched in, I want someone I can trust. I want a co-pilot that I know is going to be there. I know they're going to be there to celebrate the wins. I know they're going to be there to pick me up in the losses. And that is really what drives so much of our searching and our wanting in our relationships.
Mm-hmm. Well, what strikes me about that is interesting. To trust somebody, you got to be trustworthy. You know what I mean? And, you said it a few minutes ago with regard to when we build the best relationships, it's what can I give, right? And it's a cliche for a reason. It's better to give than receive. It feels so good to give to somebody you love, right? And so when I think about people who are looking for that to trust somebody that they can confide in, I mean, it almost feels like it's like a mirror. It's like, okay, well, you got to be trustworthy, right? You got to trust yourself, or you're going to have a hard time finding that person. Yeah. I mean, just as a really practical matter.
Yeah. And something you said earlier about relationship, you used the term betrayal. And that's exactly it. The challenge with relationship, with infidelity that so many people struggle with, it's really the trust violation. It's often not the other. It's often not even about the sex or the talking to someone else or the communication. It's the violation of trust in the relationship, that I thought we had a deal and this isn't what we did. And that's the hard part to overcome. That's the hard part to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me pivot to something else your book does beautifully. You break new ground by exploring non-traditional relationships such as polyamory, polygamy, and open relationships, and also offering what you describe as the first comprehensive scientific look at queer, and LGBTQIA plus love. I mean, there's a lot there, but let's start with poly and open relationships. Do they ever really work? And what does the data say?
Yeah. And I think one framing for me is really thinking about, so part of being an evolutionary biologist means we look at variation in traits. That's our bread and butter. We look at variation. Variation is an ingredient for evolutionary process. So relationships do vary. They vary around the globe, and they always are responding to environments and ecologies, social environment, physical environment, historical environment. So,
well, and let me just stop you there. Like the environment thing, back to social monogamy and norms, and whether you're religious or how your parents were and friends. I mean, I think it's worth me really emphasizing that, because we as social creatures, I mean, the data I think has been really clear for a long time. If you're in a friend group where one or more couples are getting divorced, that instantly increases the likelihood you're going to get divorced. If you're in a friend group that smokes, you're in a greater likelihood that you're going to smoke. Being overweight. And it goes the positive way too. If you're in a friend group where these are ambitious, high achieving people that take really good care of themselves, that becomes more of the norm. And so I just, I appreciate your emphasizing the context piece. I mean, we talked about the genetics a little while ago, but it does strike me that what is a cultural norm, and whether culture is, again, through the church or family or friends, the context that you live in. I mean, it's like, I always love this little metaphor. There were two young fish swimming in the river, and the older fish goes by and goes, "How's the water, boys?" And they go, "What water?" And it's like we're so used to our context that we don't often question it. Okay, so I'm just going to give that now. Keep going with your
I love that.
with your overview.
It's actually why so many evolutionists are interested in culture, because it shapes our experiences and expectations. The phenomenon we're talking about, researchers call social contagion, and it's exactly that idea that our surroundings influence our behavior.
And very unconsciously. I mean, that to me is what's interesting. It's like it is incumbent upon you, and especially now we're not getting into politics, but when I think about what feels normative, and it's like you really have to be that much more, I feel like, diligent and willing to think independently when there are so many narratives and counter narratives. It's like, okay, let me have that courage to to push back a little bit, and is this the best for me, and so forth. Anyway, okay, I keep interrupting. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I love it. I agree with you. And so we know that relationship structures vary. I often think of one structure that's not particularly common is polyandry. It's when a woman has more than one husband.
Polyandry.
Polyandry, yeah.
I've never heard that word. A woman has more than one husband. Where in the world does that happen, Justin? Please educate me. In Hollywood?
Yes, that's happened in Hollywood. But one example in the anthropological literature is women in the highlands of the Himalayas practice polyandry. And it's partly resource-based. It's a particular structure called fraternal polyandry. They tend to marry brothers. And
wait, what? That does not seem evolutionarily or Darwinianly wise, because then you're not getting that genetic variation, right? Does that lead to some?
Well, you get some, because most brothers aren't totally identical. But what you're really getting is another caretaker. You're really getting this idea that you have a family unit that's helping, and it's partly driven by resource allocation and family structures. So it's really, in some ways, the culture was influenced by the environment and how you would have families take care of properties and survive together. So there's all sorts of examples in the anthropological literature of different places that different cultures have different rituals around marital formations and relationship structures. Polygyny is more common. And even in cases of polygyny, you'll see where men might have
multiple... Is polygyny the same as polygamy? Am I pronouncing it wrong?
No. So this is super confusing. So polygyny or polygyny is this idea that is the concept of one male, multiple females. So many, and gyne, female. Polyandry is one female and multiple males. And then polygamy is it could go either way. It just means
Okay. I just have to say with the polyandry, I'm envisioning these gorgeous women in the Himalayas, these badass. I mean, they're not Amazonians; they're Himalayan goddesses. I'm like, yo, I want to meet you, ladies. Like, but by the way, I mean, it says something to me when I think about, oh goodness, I was on a tour at the Louvre over the summer, and they were talking, this really amazing docent was talking about, this is going off on a little tangent, I promise it connects, about how, ancient Egypt is one of the best examples of a genuinely feminist, if maternal society that really elevated women's status. And, I want to say she said, and I should be a little bit of a scholar of history, but that all came to a crashing, kind of crashing halt, I want to say around the time that Christ was born and so forth. And it's been a patriarchal world ever since. But it is really striking to me, these matriarchal, I shouldn't say maternal, matriarchal societies, like that feels like a pretty enlightened society.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot.
Like really, like, and not putting the guys down. This is not about putting the guys down. It's, it's back to a little more egalitarian and, and recognizing, women who we are unique in our ability to give birth. And there's, so much value when you do raise the status of a woman. I don't know if you guys have studied this, but I feel like I've seen studies where when that's the case, societies and families really thrive when it is more egalitarian between the masculine and feminine.
Oh, there's great evidence on it. It leads to better education outcomes, better health outcomes, better longevity outcomes. Absolutely.
So I'm just not making that up, Justin, right?
No. There's a commission. There was United Nations Commission and also World Health Organization Commission on the well-being of women, and that data is that continues to be the case. Of that importance. Everyone does when women are given educational opportunities and career opportunities. If you're interested in health, data is pretty clear. Everyone does better.
I would think it's health and economics. I would think it's all okay. So we got polyandry, we got polygyny, we've got polygamy, and then we were talking for a moment about I think polyandry,
which is a whole different polyamory is plural love. So the first three are the terms that kind of anthropologists and biologists use more, and those are really about these structures where there's multiple partners, and it's not really making a comment about the texture of the relationships. Are they loving? Are they sexual? Are they so for instance, in some societies, in some polygynous societies, men might have multiple wives. There's this great work by these anthropologists, the Hewletts. They're actually a married couple, and they've done work on Aka and the Ngunda, these tribes in Africa. And in one of their articles, they describe this man talking about his wives. And he says, well, my first wife is the one I'm the most attached to, the one that I have this deep relationship with. But we don't have sex anymore because she can't have children. And in our culture, sex is for reproduction. It's work. It's arguably more pleasurable than daytime work, but it's work. So I have sex with my new wife, but it's my first wife who I really talk to when I need connection. So that also highlights that in different societies and cultures that there's these kind of complicated nuances to relationships. Even if we see multiple partners, sort of what's going on under the hood, there's a lot more complexity in how people are connecting to each other. So that's sort of one piece of this puzzle that we see. Now, polyamory, which we talk a lot about today, that's this idea of plural love.
I was going to say define it, because I think these terms get really confusing for people.
Yeah. So polyamory is many and then amory love bond. So that's the idea of multiple romantic partnerships. Less focused on this idea on multiple just sexual partnerships. So sometimes we'll talk about open relationships as an umbrella term, or consensual non-monogamy, CNM is a term in the academic literature. Although recently some scholars have really been pushing back on using the term consensual non-monogamy because who's really consenting? So some use negotiated non-monogamy.
Oh, jeepers. Oh, you academics.
Academics. So we could see that happening, right? And we all this stuff. Now, in these consensually non-monogamous relationships, sometimes they're sexual. Sometimes people are having they're in a primary pair bond. They have a romantic bond, but then you have an open relationship. You maybe have sex with other people. In polyamory, the idea is that it's not just about the sex, that you actually have multiple love bonds. So for me, what that means is that when we look at the landscape of all these different open relationships or relationship diversity, the structures, how they vary, there's a lot of nuance of what people in different places and times are doing a lot of different things and how they structure their relationships. The vast majority in all the anthropological evidence, people are in socially monogamous relationships and often trying to maintain fidelity. But then there's all this nuance. Okay, I still haven't gotten to your core question. Does it work when we open up our relationships or we try
and how much more or less is it happening? Because I feel like if you look at the books out there, it's like, and the magazine articles, it's like, everybody's in an open relationship. Oh, you're not, like a sucker.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's much more of like hype than what's actually happening. But you know the data, so
yeah, I think that's right.
Me.
We published a paper and we were able to replicate the finding that we found that about 1 in 5 single Americans have at some point had an open relationship, some point in their life.
1 out of 5. That's actually shocking. 20%. Huh.
20% at some point. As my collaborator Emmy Moores would say, that's the same number of people who have a cat. So if you know someone who has a cat, you know someone who had an open relationship.
That's funny. That's a good comparison.
But that's ever. Now, it's a much smaller number who are currently in an open relationship of some sort. And so that's the amount of people who have ever tried it. And for some people, it does work really well. My sense is, and based on the difference between the 20% who try it and the less than 5% who are in one, that it would suggest that people try it, but it raises different challenges. All relationships come with kind of challenges and negotiation. Having multiple partners comes with a whole set of new ones. And so for most people, I think that I think for the people who it works for often really well. Diversify your interests and your needs, your emotional and your sexual needs. But for a lot of people, they're contending with jealousy. They contend with.
You got to be pretty damn emotionally mature and self-aware. I would think, I haven't tried it, but I would think that you have to be a pretty special person for that to actually work. And then you're with a special person for that to work. Otherwise, to your point, the collateral damage of jealousy and hurt feelings and so forth.
And researchers talk about, that's exactly right. And researchers talk about a compersion, which is when you have a new partner come in, the novelty, the excitement of the novel, the new partner, and you can sometimes forget about the other partner or partners. And you are thinking about ways to expand your relationship, but you could be potentially damaging those other bonds. So there's a lot to negotiate. Some people do it beautifully and they can do it well. My sense is that most can't do it that well when they try it. I think that sort of bears out in the data. So now to the point though, your point about, I think I think monogamous people often say, okay, oh, you're doing that thing over there. And like, how on earth can you do that? You don't get the real comfort of a loving relationship. And people who are in open relationships often say, well, how could you be shackled by this cultural notion of monogamy? There's a recent paper out, a meta-analysis by Joel Anderson and colleagues that found that the satisfaction levels, the relationship satisfaction levels in socially monogamous and non-monogamous people are the same. So what that
hang on, say that again. The satisfaction in socially monogamous and non-monogamous
are the same.
Are the same. Oh, that's actually
so what
interesting.
that tells me is that all these sort of arguments of like who's doing a better job or what's the better way, that's all bullshit. Right? It's just the different ways that we can structure our relationships. And that's part of our evolutionary story. People structure our relationships in different ways, and they each come with different costs and benefits. But to my belief of what the evidence is, that the vast majority of people are drawn to pair bonds. We're drawn to a deep connection. And there are some people who have multiple pair bonds, or they have a pair bond and that they also release their sexual life. But at the end of the day, what I still see in all of that landscape is the power of a pair bond union. Even if you have multiple ones, even if you have different rules about what it means for your sex life, that still is what people of all stripes are craving.
Interesting. That is interesting. I mean, and it's almost like that is the gold standard. That's the ideal. If all the boxes can be checked, and if all the boxes aren't checked, then it's okay. Almost like revert to a hybrid. Or something that says, okay, I'm not getting this particular need met, this thing that I'm looking for, and and so that gold standard slips. That's really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about, for my queer and LGBTQIA plus brothers, sisters, what does the research show about how these, I think you said just you've done some studying maybe on how is it their sex lives are changing, or talk to me about that.
Yeah, similar questions, I think. Now, there's not as much academic literature. So much of their literature has been on heterosexual people and couples. So we're trying to do more at the Kinsey Institute. A lot of our colleagues around the world are doing more. And again, for me, it's just widening the lens. How do we understand more of the human experience and human nature? Now, in some ways, what's interesting is like there are studies, for instance, on dating and who should pay for a date, men or women. Well, that goes out the window when you're looking at gay and lesbian couples or people. And then they'll have different rules, so that it'll be, well, whoever asks for the date is the one. I think that's also interesting in a context where we talk about gender and gender egalitarianism. Well, there's things we can learn that are interesting when we look at how gay and lesbian people are structuring their dating lives. We also did some studies on one of our big studies with my colleague Dave Frederick, where we looked at what keeps passion alive in couples long term. We had, I think, over 50,000 people on the sample. And we looked at also a sample of gay men and lesbian women. And in some ways, what was interesting is it was remarkably similar across sexual orientations. And you have different pressures. Gay men and couples and lesbian women and couples often have different social pressures. The sexual behaviors look different. I mean, even the very question, if you ask someone, did you have sex last night? Well, the actual behaviors you might do if you're straight, gay, or lesbian are quite different, which is also why part of what we do at the Kinsey Institute is really carefully think about when we ask those questions, like what are you really getting at if you methodologically. So the question of passion, what we found is across all orientations, things like mood setting was really important. And it wasn't about the candle itself. It wasn't about lighting the candle or the flame or the scent. It was more saying, I'm carving time out of my day. I'm making an intention for us to set a mood, to be intimate with each other. So things like that were remarkably similar. What we did find, particularly for lesbian women, though, was that sexual frequency dropped off a lot faster than in heterosexual and gay men.
Oh, and interesting.
Sometimes people have referred to this as lesbian bed death was this term. And I never liked it.
Hang on, lesbian, wait, say it again?
Lesbian bed death was the term.
Oh, good Lord. Sorry, sisters. Not no good.
Yeah, exactly. And I never liked this term because a lot of people have bed
I don't either.
Gay people. But it was partly because it was recognizing this decline in sexual frequency. But what we found was that even though the frequency declined, the levels of satisfaction didn't decline.
I was about to say that. I bet the emotional fulfillment that these women are getting from each other really balances. I mean, listen, to me, more sex is better sex, right? But to the extent that it's like they don't maybe crave it as much physically because they're getting more of that emotional hit from each other. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you nailed it. That's exactly right.
Awesome.
And we found that in separate studies we've done. We have an aging and sexuality initiative at the Kinsey Institute, and we're finding similar stuff with people age, is that sexual frequency declines. It doesn't mean satisfaction is declining. It doesn't mean quality is declining. And in fact, for women, particularly at the menopausal transition, we see slight upticks in satisfaction and in orgasm rates, which is perhaps paradoxical at the same time that a lot of women are having sexual problems. Well, one sort of if you can manage that or tease that data apart, yes, there are women who are having problems, but then they're also tending to have slower sex, more foreplay, more emotional connection, more comfort in their body and then their relationship.
Well, I would think it correlates with greater confidence, greater like not giving a F. I mean, just like a whole bunch of those things. I mean, what I've always heard is the most important sex organ is the brain.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about when it comes to emotional safety and it comes to like being able to ask for what you want and being more vocal in bed, right? Making sure you get the satisfaction and then making sure you're giving that satisfaction. I mean, to me, I would think that all correlates a lot with confidence, which for, particularly women, I think as they age, it just naturally goes up.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing effect.
It is amazing. I'm going to just tell you right now, empirically, it's true.
Yeah, girl. Yeah.
I don't even need a study.
I love it.
That
and
is hilarious.
These narratives, right? Everything, this idea that, that our sex lives are ruined as we get older, or that it's
Oh no,
and
that's
that
not
has
true.
these impacts on our relationship. It actually we can become much richer, and it's amazing.
Well, let me go back to I'm curious about the passion survey that you talked about. What were the number one or two findings? Are people getting more satisfaction? And I can dream about what that might reveal, or it may like a lot less passion. What are those top two or three insights?
Yeah. So what we found is that overall, people tend to, in long-term relationships, the longer you're in a relationship, that the sort of fire tends to burn a little less hot over time. That's true. So sometimes we talk in the research about the shift from passionate love to companionate love in long term. The sort of the fire of wanting to rip each other's clothes off to the kind of wanting to hold each other's hands and cuddle on the couch. But what we were interested in, who are those couples that the fire stayed 5, 10, 20 years in? And what they were doing were things we found, they were engaging in more oral sex. They were, so in terms of their sexual behavior, they were engaging in more mood setting, things like lighting and candles. So they were
More intentional.
more intentional. Their sexual
I
lives
love
were
that.
more intentional. They were having a lot more communication, including communication about their relationship and their sex life. And then there was also one funny thing that it was like looking at reading like magazines, like Cosmo kind of magazines. I thought, well, is it because they're picking up tips? I actually think it's similar to the candles. It was more they're going out of their way to think about their intimate life. They're just saying like, hey, this is a priority. I want to read something about it. I want to talk about it. I learned this.
Well, that's also probably back to the oxytocin discussion we had a little while ago, where it's like, I want to bring something new in, right? That novelty really does activate those yummy neurochemicals. So to me, I would think it's both intellectually intent, it's sort of emotionally intention, but I also think just the novelty, hey, let's try this, activates the brain in ways that are valuable.
Exactly. The novelty and the new things give you that sort of dopamine hit. And in the context of a partner, you get that oxytocin hit and you start to feel that novelty, that excitement in the context of your partner. It feels good and you want it again.
Well, and then that leads to long-term attachment. I mean, I'm not a neurobiologist, but when I think, what I've read and studied, and it's like, okay, this is how 1 + 1 = 11.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's the sort of that remarkable power of why relationships are so central, why intimate relationships are so central to our lives, why we crave them, why we're drawn to them. And I think also why when there's challenges in them, it can feel so devastating for people because these relationships are so important. There's so much that we get out of it biologically, psychologically, socially, culturally. They are central. And it's why I think we need venues like this, right? That we're talking about them and unpacking them and cultivating that connection in our lives.
Well, totally. And it's a perfect segue. We've given ourselves a perfect segue. I said toward the beginning of our conversation, since you're the executive director of the famous and highly influential Kinsey Institute, and what you're driven to do, we're at the perfect place. So, Justin, first, why don't you say what the Kinsey Institute does? Maybe even talk. There's some famous, I think Masters and Johnson, and some of the really famous outcomes that your fine institution has put out into the world. Let's start there. And then I have a few other things that I want to ask you about your research.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the great honors of my career is that I lead the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, so in Bloomington, Indiana. And the institute was founded in 1947, at the time as a separate 501c3 by Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey, who was a zoologist. And a movie starring Liam Neeson over 20 years ago now. It was hard to believe it was that long ago. Featured Kinsey's work in a biopic film.
Right. Oh my God, I almost forgot about that. Oh, I got to go back and watch that. Ooh, so good.
Neeson and Laura Linney, and it's a fun film. I've used it in the classroom in the past. And so Kinsey was a taxonomist. He initially studied gall wasps, and he then was asked to team teach the university's marriage course in the 1930s, 1938. And increasingly, U.S. universities had these sort of sexual hygiene marriage courses. And in some ways, I think it represents the very best of what should happen at a university.
I was going to say, wow, I never knew that. That's a novel idea, because I think of the sex ed my kids are getting, and I'm like, wait, what? It is so bad. It's so
bad. We can come back. We have a study on sex ed. We can come back to that. So Kinsey was asked to team teach this class, and the students had so many questions that Kinsey said, we've got to find answers. It's not in the library. And find the answers in the book. Let's go start interviewing people. Let's start doing these sexual histories and collect more data and evidence. And he had kind of been in the business of big data with his gall wasp. He collected millions of samples. And then now he started doing it with people's sexual lives. So after 2 years, the university chancellor at the time said, well, you can either do this big study or you can go back teaching the class. And so he sort of then from there did this, to this day, one of the most influential studies on human sexuality. And so in 1947, it was then called the Institute for Sex Research. And initially it was much more focused just on sex and sexuality. And but less so in the ways that we think about it today. So not really about identities, but more about behaviors and what were people doing. And there were these two blockbuster books, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male in 1948, and then Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953, today called the Kinsey Reports. And America responded very differently. The first book, instant bestseller about men and men's sexual lives. 5 years later, talking about everyone's wives, sisters, mothers, daughters. There were book burnings around the country.
I was going to say, no me gusta. People don't like that, right?
No,
God forbid.
So, it's funny, though, because in order to have a book burning, you still have to buy the book to burn it. So it was still a bestseller.
Oh, my God. America, take note. Oh, my God. With all these books that are being banned, go buy it so then you can burn it. Exactly. But don't burn it.
Don't burn it. Put it in the library. And so the Institute today has sort of three wings, and there's a kind of a deep history between now and then. And the lens has been widened. So a lot of our work in the last 20 years is both sex and relationships. We really focus on the context of sex, whether it's by alone, it's solo, or it's a hookup, or it's a sex worker, or it's a long-term relationship, or it's a marriage. So relationships are a big part of all of our work as well. And there's three wings to the Institute. So we have 9 research centers and laboratories tucked within. So we have different groups that have, like we have one group that specializes on condom use and misuse. We have another group, my lab group with Amanda Gesselman. We focus on romantic and sexual relationships. We have a group that works on sexual health and disability. Then we have an education program. So we have a PhD minor tied to the university, and we have a certificate program. So some people come for a week intensive for a professional certificate in sexuality. And then the third part of the Kinsey Institute is our library and special collections. And that in some ways is the we talk a lot about the research part, and that's in the news a lot. But the library and special collections, it's the largest research collection of sexuality-related materials in the world. We have 750,000 items in the archives. And it's everything from fine art to film to archives. We have the archives of Kinsey, of Masters and Johnson, of Helen Fisher, of Ruth Westheimer. All these sort of legends, their archives are with us, and we are stewards of that. We have librarians and archivists and curators who handle that. So there's different kind of parts of this machine to really preserve and make accessible the history of sexuality and relationships for the world. It's a remarkable place. And the other thing I'll add, and then we talk. Sorry, I'm talking so much. I love talking. The other thing that I really love about the Institute is the vision was always bringing different specialties together, and not to create like a major, which often happens at universities. What we do as a research institute is I can run up and down the hall, and there's a biologist, a psychologist, a physician, a neuroscientist, a sociologist, a historian. And the idea was bringing all these different disciplines and their theories and their techniques and methods together, and learning and sharing from each other in our shared study of sex and relationships. So it really is, it's like the definition of a multidisciplinary organization. And that's what makes it so fun. We just see the world differently. But it also means whenever I'm writing an academic article, I could just run down the hall and be like, someone here knows what I'm looking for.
That is amazing. Well, I got to say, when I think about, and I touched on this before, and it honestly hurts my heart when I think about how sex in our society has been so degraded, so exploited, so commercialized, so corrupted, causing so much confusion. And, I think about from the church to how sex is trivialized in media and a lot of publishing, in the government and so forth. Something that is so natural, important, beautiful, even sacred. To me, really, it really is. It feels like this thing that is sacred. And, and you go back to Cleopatra, and, especially again in the matriarchal cultures where women's bodies were venerated. And so I guess I'm grateful for what, you and your colleagues are doing, in terms of doing this research, educating people, because it feels like there's a lot of headwinds that are, and I don't know. I mean, it just feels like something that should be beautiful and pleasurable, really causes a lot of people a lot of heartache, from, feeling bad if they're touching their own bodies, to, men especially young men, feeling like they've got to perform and, have unrealistic expectations. So I feel like I get these little, from my own observations to, just studies I read and, people that I interview and so forth, for all the good and beauty and sacredness, there is a shadow side to how people experience sex and pleasure, that it honestly makes me sad. And do you agree? And what can we do about it?
Oh gosh, I totally agree with you. There's so much shame around sex, in part because we don't talk about it enough, and just even the things like, I had a graduate student who's now a faculty member, who is doing really great work on pain, with sexual pain that women feel, and same thing, like this shame of like, do I report it? Is it okay? What does it mean about me, about my relationship, about my body? Do I go to a doctor? More often than not, they go to a doctor. The doctors don't know anything about it, or they tell them it's fine.
Well, they don't get educated. And from what I've heard from gynecologists, that female sexual health ain't a thing in med school.
No, most physicians get 1 hour of training on human sexuality. They get 30 minutes on male sexual dysfunction and 30 minutes on female sexual dysfunction. And it's just like, this is a broken
Well, what's interesting is because back to the very beginning of our conversation, when we think about the sex drive as being one of the most powerful, human impulses, right? And it's like, it feels really disrespected in a lot of ways in our society,
it is,
right? And then trivialized and so forth.
Exactly. And then I think, we'll turn to a physician or a therapist, and we expect that they have some background, because who do you go to? Where do you go to when you need help in matters of sex and love in your relationship?
Your tango. Hello.
Yeah, your tango. That's where you should go. Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
But this idea that, even with one of the stories I talk about in the book is a family member, my cousin Jen, when she had cancer, brain cancer, and how her and her husband and our whole family navigated it. And it's, talking about like caretaker burden is a technical term that researchers call it, and the impact of that on a relationship. And most people are, if they have a serious illness, no one's necessarily coming in and saying, okay, let's talk about your relationship. Let's talk about your sex life. Let's talk about your marriage. But these are all intertwined. And at a time, for instance, these studies on breast cancer, one of the strongest predictors of survivorship is spousal support.
Oh, I have read research, and people are going to get really mad when I say this. I read research, and it was in a very credible oncology publication, that having that kind of real safety and support from particularly a spouse, I think if maybe a family more broadly, was as efficacious as getting chemotherapy. And that blew me away. It's like, that can't be true. But you even say, oh my goodness, I wrote this exactly.
And the spousal support, it's critical to
love and care can literally save your life, is what you say, which I totally agree.
I believe it. It's true. It's in the evidence.
Love and care and great sex, Justin.
Yeah. Now a healthy and a happy life. Yeah. And so and partly, that's Sue Carter's argument about oxytocin, is that it's part of the immune system, that it really does help regulate our immune function. And
hang on, can you just talk about, I just interrupted you, and I do love Sue and the, of course, legendary Steve Porges, father of the polyvagal theory. Yeah, no, I got to know them both when I interviewed them when I wrote my book a long time ago, and they've just stayed friends. Just rewind for a minute and talk about Sue's research, because I do think this is really relevant. Just in a sentence or two, her research into oxytocin. I think that will be illuminating to people. Yeah.
So Sue Carter, who's the former Kinsey Institute director, is was the world expert on some of the effects of oxytocin, a hormone, technically a neuropeptide, and how it is associated with bonding and social behavior. And in particular, she's done studies on two species of voles, the little rodent vole, VOLE, and that one is socially monogamous and one is not. And part of the big difference is these oxytocin receptors in their brain, the prairie vole and the montane vole. And so Sue's for decades has looked at oxytocin and in vole models, but then in humans also its impacts on health and well-being and social connection. And we know that these oxytocin systems are really important for social connection. In part, in our evolutionary history, it's important between a mother and a baby. So oxytocin is associated with milk letdown and with breastfeeding and bonding. So there's this same peptide is involved in different things. It's also connection with our romantic partners and our sexual partners. And we know that you get a burst of oxytocin with orgasm. So that's why some people have argued that with sexual activity, you can start to facilitate bonding, which is maybe
that that leads to attachment, whether you like it or not, a lot of the times, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And Sue has also done studies on well-being, both physical and mental health and oxytocin. And in fact, another researcher did studies looking at wound healing. And where you in the laboratory, you give people little cuts on their hand and you look at wound healing. And the people with higher oxytocin levels, their wounds healed faster. And that's partly the sort of biochemistry of it. It looks like it's really part of the immune system. And it's really remarkable and how it's associated with how close bonds are associated with our physical and mental health. And this is probably the biological mechanism by how it works.
Oh my God, I love that so much. I can't even tell you. Well, and I'll add a couple quick things, and we've been talking for a while, so I would love to keep talking. Yeah, you have to come back. But Dr. Joe Dispenza has released some really interesting information about, using mindfulness and meditation and techniques. He teaches in partnership with the University of San Diego to show that these kinds of techniques really do change your immunological outcomes. And they do, from breast milk to saliva, blood chemistry. It is amazing to me. And this goes, necessarily beyond relationships, but I think of them as going hand in hand, right? Because if you take good care of yourself and you're emotionally regulated, and then you're in strong bonds, in relationships, right? You're activating that oxytocin. It does strike me that does generate better health outcomes. Okay, the one I wanted to come back to, last question for you. I interviewed a lady named Dr. Anna Mashan, and she was talking about beta endorphins as a kind of the lesser known and I think it's a neurotransmitter. I'm not a neurobiologist, so I might be getting the terminology wrong, but I was really surprised to learn. I'd never heard of this term. And she talked about how oxytocin can become, you have a decreased tolerance to it, if you will, or an increased tolerance, actually increased, versus beta endorphins as a molecule that is less studied, but really does help form those social bonds and so forth. And I'm such a nerd about this stuff. I just wanted to ask you in case you had thoughts on beta endorphins, since I hadn't heard much about it.
I don't know that literature nearly as well. I know Chris and stuff.
Could be a new opportunity for Kinsey.
I know. I like this. I'm about to go. I'm getting ready to open up my Google Scholar in a minute.
I love it.
And look, I don't know that as well. I'm going to find out.
Oh, okay.
We'll circle back.
Yeah. No. And that's why I love doing this show. it is like the greatest job ever that I get to interview people that are as passionate and as knowledgeable as you are. And every now and then I get to connect the dots. Yeah. Justin,
your tango of having a place that people can find information about love and connection and intimacy.
Yeah. It really is. To me, when I think about the most important thing, from even just referring to the Harvard research, the Grant and Glueck studies going back, these longitudinal studies that millions of dollars have been spent on, even touching on Dr. Carter's research, the longevity outcomes, the health outcomes, the economic outcomes, I forget his name, but the author of the Grant study, he concluded by saying happiness is love, full stop. And that's what it keeps coming back to. Okay, I'm going to give you the last word. Any final thing you want to leave anybody with from either from The Intimate Animal, your beautiful new book, which is on sale coming up next week, or any other research that you've conducted that you'd really want people to take away as we conclude our show today?
Yeah, I'll end actually on this note on sexual education. We had a paper published within the last few months with my colleagues Jessica Hilly and Amanda Gesselman, and what we found was that looking at a national sample, we asked people what were the sources of your sex education when you were younger, and some people said school, family, a vast majority friends, vast majority said they had no formal background, and we asked them if you had had more education, how do you think it would have impacted your life? And 44% of our samples said if they had had more comprehensive sex ed, they would have happier and healthier romantic and sexual relationships today. Not just sex lives, but relationships. So that's a lot of people who are saying, if I just had access to information. So I think my takeaway is really we need to be studying love and sex more. We need to be writing about it. We need to be talking about it like we are here. That was my goal in The Intimate Animal in the book. The more we can discover, the more light we can shed on darkness in terms of romantic and sexual connections, the healthier and happier we can be. And that's something we can all do together.
Amen to that. That's why we're here. And it's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Dustin Garcia. Yeah, I've loved this. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll see you next time on Getting Open.